All right, good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. My name's Carrie Bingen. I'm the director of the CSIS Aerospace Security Project. Welcome to the inaugural CSIS Space Strategic Dialogue. I am especially pleased to have General Stephen Whiting, commander of the United States Space Command, with us to launch this series. A few weeks ago, we watched NASA astronauts circle the moon, a testament to human ingenuity and technological progress. But it's just a glimpse of the changes underway in space, bringing both extraordinary opportunity but also growing risk. Too often, though, these changes are not well understood. So our purpose with this dialogue is simple: to close that gap. This dialogue is a platform for serious, sustained conversations, bringing together leaders from across our ecosystems to examine the activities and threats unfolding in space and what they mean for security, stability, and strategic competition. We are doing things a bit differently, pairing expert discussions with compelling visuals to make the space domain more accessible and concrete. And we're committed to broadening the audience, which is why you'll see here today students, embassy representatives, congressional staff, leaders from industry, from government, and even engaged citizens who are interested in where we're heading in space. Today, our focus is on space and the future of warfare, beginning with a fireside chat with General Whiting on the evolving threat environment and what these trends mean for policy, operations, and investment priorities. We will build upon these themes then with a terrific panel of experts. Future discussions will address topics such as growing traffic jams in space and technology trends shaping the future in space. I will say we could not do these kind of events and discussions without the generous support we receive from our donors. So I want to particularly thank LeoLabs and Tony Frazier for enabling us to undertake this series, and then also to thank the Bertelsmann Foundation for the visuals that you'll see today. Now, please turn your attention to the screen for a message from Congressman Mike Rogers of Alabama, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee.
I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but it's a pleasure to help launch this important space strategic dialogue at CSIS. Discussions about cross-cutting issues affecting military, civilian, and commercial activities help strengthen our advantage in space. The need for that advantage has never been more evident than in the past few months. We are seeing the power of America's space capabilities every day, the real operational effects that Space Force is bringing to military operations around the world, including in the Middle East. The work of the United States Space Command and the Space Force is absolutely vital to our national security and economic prosperity. That is precisely why I work to establish them in law, and I'm proud of the tremendous progress both have made over the past 6 years. That work continues today on the House Armed Services Committee. Last year, we streamlined the Pentagon's acquisition process, improving efficiency and reducing the time it takes to field capabilities. We're building on that progress this year, and I'm pleased that the President's budget request for the Space Force meets the moment with significant investments in our space security. As we grow our defense capabilities in space, our commercial sector is also expanding rapidly. Our commercial space industry, truly the envy of the world, is the powerful source of innovation and strategic advantage. Even so, as our industry has grown, our competitors, particularly China and Russia, have not stood still. But this threat is difficult to fully recognize. Unlike in other domains where we can see aerial dogfighting or the buildup of foreign maritime forces, space operations unfold far from the public eye. There are no video clips capturing what is happening hundreds of miles above the Earth. Addressing the threat to our space leadership means bringing awareness to it. So this space strategic dialogue comes at a critical moment, and I commend CSIS for undertaking such a timely and important effort.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tony Frazier, the CEO of LeoLabs. It's a pleasure to be here today to kick off the CSIS Space Strategic Dialogue Series. We're at a pivotal moment. Recent events demonstrate that modern warfare is not just enabled by space, it now extends to space. Adversaries like China and Russia are dramatically increasing their launch cadence and developing sophisticated capabilities to both deny US-based superiority and utilize space to their advantage to place US and allied forces at risk. This accelerating threat environment demands a coordinated response. The CSIS Strategic Space Dialogue Series is a unique forum where operational leaders, policymakers, and industry can gather to not only align on the challenges, but collaborate to define actionable solutions. We're fortunate today to be joined by renowned experts in the space warfighting domain, but I'm especially grateful to welcome General Stephen Whiting to be with us today, the commander of U.S. Space Command, who will kick off today's event. General Whiting's profound leadership, deep experience, unique operating perspective are shaping how the United States approaches space as a warfighting domain and prioritizing the capabilities required to ensure we maintain our advantage as the threat continues to escalate. General Whiting, thank you for being here. I want to thank CSIS for hosting this conversation. We're proud to partner with you on this series. And with that, Carrie, I'll turn it over to you.
Here. Thanks. All right, General Whiting, Commander of U.S. Space Command. When we last talked, I think I gave you a different title. I said Strategic Command, but we're so pleased to have you here, Commander of U.S. Space Command. He and I have talked in a couple of different forums over the year, each one a little different, but we've never been here in person at CSIS. So thank you very much for making the time to come talk to us at this inaugural event. CSIS convenes multiple dialogues. We have a maritime security dialogue, a land power dialogue. I think by the end of this conversation, you'll see why there's a need for a space strategic dialogue as well. I do recognize we're competing with the Pentagon's budget rollout day, so thank you all for being here. I think you'll see, though, is as your general lays out, where we're going and what our needs are, and hopefully we'll see that in the budget request that comes out later today in the J-Books. So we'll go ahead and take audience questions. So if you're here in person, scan the QR code. And if you're online, please go ahead to the website and submit a question. First, I'm going to start with some current events. We'll go to a discussion on space and the future of warfare, and then we'll dive into joint and coalition warfighting. First, let's talk Artemis II. Artemis II, just a few weeks ago, we saw the SLS and Orion take off with 4 astronauts, fly by the moon. NASA civilian mission, but I don't think people realize that Space Command and our U.S. Space Forces also had a role in that mission. So can you talk a bit about Space Command's role, but also as a national space leader, what has seeing us return to the moon meant to you and to all the space professionals that you lead?
Yeah, Carrie, it's just so inspiring, and just congratulations to NASA and all involved in the Artemis program. I was alive when Neil Armstrong walked out on the lunar surface, but I was less than 2 years old, so I don't remember it. I do have a memory of one of the latter Apollo missions. I must have been 4 or 5, laying in the back of my dad's station wagon. They didn't belt us kids in back then. It's amazing any of us from Gen X are still alive at this point. And I remember my mom and dad saying, there's a man on the moon right now. And that's a memory that's stuck with me. And now we're going back 50 years later. So inspiring. I think it's just the first step, one small step in this giant leap of what's about to happen over the next several decades as we move out into the solar system. But U.S. Space Command did have a role, and we were so proud to be a part, just small part of the team effort. But when the astronauts were recovered, they were on the Orion capsule under the parachutes as those astronauts went into the Pacific Ocean. It was our job to have the recovery forces there that got those astronauts and safely brought them on board the ships. One of my responsibilities is I am the DoD manager for human spaceflight support, and so we worked across the Joint Force with the Navy, with the Air Force, with Indo-Pacific Command, with U.S. Transportation Command, and we had all our forces arrayed, the forces that you saw, because that was a nominal, exactly as planned recovery, but also if it had gone off nominal and landed somewhere that we did not expect, a contingency recovery, we had forces ready to do that too. So we were very proud to be a part of that. And then when the Artemis mission was on orbit, it was also Space Force forces that were performing conjunction analysis, making sure they weren't hitting a piece of debris, that they had all the GPS they needed. So yeah, we were proud to be a part of that mission.
Oh, that's super to hear. It was very inspiring and great to see Space Command's role. There's another dimension to this as we think about the broader picture of strategic competition as we return to the moon and expand our cislunar activities. China is also pushing into this area. Can you help us understand the security dimension to this race and what role the U.S. military will play in that aspect?
If we go back to the beginning of the space age with the launch of Sputnik, space was birthed in great power competition. It was the United States against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union won the opening chapters of that space race when they launched Sputnik, the first animal, the first man, the first woman. But ultimately, the United States won that space race when Neil Armstrong walked down the lunar surface. I think there's another race right now. China wants to get to the moon. Certainly the United States. We're going to demonstrate that not only did we do it 50 years ago, we're going to do it again. And I think we've just seen the importance that China has placed on their space aspirations. They have moved unbelievably fast. I could say remarkably fast, jaw-droppingly fast, breathtakingly fast. It's every time we think they're going fast, they accelerate. And they've done that with their military space capabilities, with their quasi-commercial space capabilities, now with their civil space capabilities. Now, my desire is to see that as they go to cislunar, that is only for exploration purposes, to achieve their own national goals. But we've got to maintain vigilance to make sure that China or any other actor is not using cislunar space, ex-geo, we call that more broadly, space for military advantage.
Yeah. And we'll dive in much greater depth on what we see China and what we see others doing in space. But let me also talk through another headline that we've been watching closely, and it's the recent military operations. So whether we talk Operation Epic Fury or Operation Absolute Resolve, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, has publicly discussed how space and cyber effects have been layered into those campaigns. So for those of us that are wondering, what the heck does space effects mean? What the heck does space effects mean? And how are they being integrated into that broader joint military planning and operational process? What does it look like? How should we think about it?
I really appreciate the chairman, General Kane, and the Secretary Hegseth, how they've highlighted the contribution of space forces, cyber forces. And when we say it's layered in, this means from the very beginning of the planning, as we're thinking about multi-domain operations, how do you bring land, air, sea capabilities? It's not just those three, it's now space and cyber that are from the beginning figuring out how do we best use those capabilities. The capabilities people are most often think about with regard to space would be the effects we've provided for decades, satellite communications, how do we optimize those for operations, GPS, weather, missile warning has been huge in this, the most recent operations. Certainly, Iran has built a very robust ballistic missile force, and it's our missile warning capabilities that are truly unique across the entire planet, where we can detect those launches and provide that information to our fielded forces in real time and then up to our national leaders as well. But it's also capabilities that we've layered in, like electronic warfare. The chairman has talked about how space and cyber capabilities helped to blind the adversary to what our operations are. And so it's those kind of things as well that we have fully nested into these overall operations.
Well, and I wanted to just put, for the audience in the room here, they can see it, coming off the Space Command website, I saw a picture of, this is the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command's 1st Space Brigade. This is a deployable and deploying brigade. So just, can you talk a little bit as well about, the Guardians and then the Joint Force, they're deploying around the world.
Yeah, we have forces from all the services. Certainly the lion's share of that comes from the U.S. Space Force to U.S. Space Command. And they're supporting operations from a lot of operations centers right here in the United States. However, we've also had forces from the Army, from the Space Force, from some of the other services that have deployed into theater, into harm's way to ensure these space effects are provided. And something that not everybody may be tracking is space capabilities in theater have been targeted, have been struck, and unfortunately we lost a soldier from this very unit, the 1st Space Brigade, Staff Sergeant Ben Pennington, who perished in the first several days or week of the war. And our thoughts go out to his family, his parents Tim and Carrie, for the incredible young man that they raised and gave to us. And he proved that yes, space systems tend to be hundreds, if not thousands of miles away in space, but the military personnel who operate them are willing to give their all.
Yeah, I mean, it is a tremendous sacrifice that they and their families make. So thank you very much for highlighting that, and Sergeant Pennington. Let's make sure that we level set here on just why space matters for those that maybe have not been tracking this conversation as intimately as you and I have. I mean, we've long said the United States, we are dominant. We are dominant in our military advantage, in our technology advantage, including in the area of space. So, as you sit here and look at the strategic landscape before us, can you frame, what does that picture look like in space right now? Why does it matter for national security? And frankly, why do we have a space command? Start there.
Yeah, if you go back over decades, the United States went to space for strategic advantage. You may recall in the early 60s, U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, and Francis Gary Powers famously, was captured and ultimately came back to the United States. But we had to go to space because we could no longer use air assets to develop the critical national intelligence that we needed to be able to track the missiles and all the developments that were happening in the Eastern Bloc. And then as we went through the 70s and up into the 80s, we were continuing to leverage space for nuclear command and control, for strategic communications, but threats were building as well. And then in Desert Storm, what we call the first space war, not because Saddam Hussein took us on in space, but because for the first time, we took these strategic capabilities we had built in space for strategic purposes, and we applied them to the tactical battlefield. So for 35 plus years now, we have driven space effects into our multi-domain joint force. And why is that important? And I give that history is because over the last 35 years, the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps have become optimized and assume that they're going to have access to space capabilities through all levels of conflict. If space is lost, they cannot fight the way they are designed nor sized. They do not have the force structure to fight the way we used to fight without space, because space makes us tremendously more precise, lethal, and far-ranging. And so we've noted that the Chinese and the Russians have studied us since Desert Storm. They deeply have tried to understand how is it that the United States is able to create such global effects with what appear to be such small number of forces, and they've assessed that space is one of those foundational issues. And so now they have developed a suite of counter space weapons. So the strategic landscape we find ourselves in is that we derive enormous benefits from space for our national defense, also for our economy, and we could talk about how it enables our modern way of life, but now we face determined opponents who, if we get into a conflict, are going to try to take that away from us. So we've got to be able to protect and defend our space capabilities so that we can continue to derive the advantages that they give to us.
And let's build on that. We've seen, and you mentioned the integration of space into these modern battlefields. What are you taking away from the use of space in Ukraine, the use of space in the Middle East? What's relevant to, say, the Indo-Pacific? But it's not just what are we learning as a space community, but also what's the joint force learning about the use of space and challenges to space?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep the answer brief because I know CSIS and other think tanks are going to write whole studies about this because this is a a really defining moment in what are the lessons that we're learning. Yeah. And I'll just hit a few. One is that space will be contested, and you can go back to the opening night of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where Russia executed a cyber attack against a commercial SATCOM company because they wanted to deny Ukraine's ability to leverage that SATCOM for command and control. Now, unfortunately, that cyber attack kind of got out into the wild across Europe, and I think 40 or 50,000 SATCOM modems were taken off the air. Now, Russia could have directly attacked in space. They've demonstrated that capability. In fact, they did a hit-to-kill ASAT test 3 months before they invaded Ukraine to send a signal to us in the West, the rest of the West. But they would rather attack us in cyber because it's easier for them, cheaper for them, and harder for us to attribute. So that's one. We've also seen persistent SATCOM and GPS jamming, where they have, again, contested our use of those capabilities. I think we've seen the rise of commercial space, where even nations who don't have their own governmental indigenous strong space program can now go onto the commercial market to get imagery, to get satellite communications, to get other forms of intelligence. And that means any foe now that we go into a conflict with, we have to assume they're going to have somehow access to those space capabilities, which speaks to the ubiquity now of imagery, for example, how that is making the entire battlefield transparent. There are not sanctuaries for our forces anymore, and we've seen that in Iran. When a medium-sized power like Iran has the ability to build long-range strike weapons, whether ballistic missile or one-way attack drones, and then pair that with the ubiquity of imagery to strike fixed targets, that's something we now have to contend with. You know, there's a lot of other lessons, but maybe those are three general areas that I would highlight here.
And I'm starting to see questions come in a couple of those different areas, so I'll get to those in a moment, but I do want to hit a few other areas. Let's talk a bit further about the threats that you're seeing to the space domain. And Chairman Rogers mentioned, you know, we can see threats unfolding in other domains. We can see what aerial dogfighting looks like. You can watch Top Gun. You can see what unsafe practices at sea look like. You can see the effects of missiles. Space is just a more challenging area to visualize and get your head around. So we you know, thanks to LeoLabs and us partnering with the Bertelsmann Foundation, who's a phenomenal documentary filmmaker, we were able to create some visualizations just to give you all a better sense of what we're seeing in space. So we're gonna play two videos here, and then General, I'd like to get your reactions to them. So if we can cue up the first one, and this is what's happening in low Earth orbit that the Russians are doing. On August 1st, 2022, a Russian military satellite called Cosmos 2558 was launched on a Soyuz rocket from Plesetsk spaceport, about 500 miles north of Moscow. After reaching low Earth orbit, the region closest to Earth often used by reconnaissance satellites, Cosmos 2558 settled into nearly the same path as a U.S. government satellite, which is called a coplanar orbit. For nearly 3 years, the Russian satellite stalked the American one, both traveling at more than 17,000 miles per hour. Then, in June 2025, things got really interesting. Cosmos 2558 released a much smaller object, about 1/9 its size, like a Matryoshka nesting doll. The U.S. Space Force later identified this new sub-satellite as Object C. After separating, Object C began maneuvering on its own, making adjustments that showed it could control its movement and position in orbit, presumably while continuing to follow the U.S. satellite. These movements, called rendezvous and proximity operations, can be used for routine tasks like inspection, but also military ones. Satellites designed for close maneuvering could carry a range of payloads, from surveillance equipment to electronic jamming systems, and in some cases even high-speed projectiles. This is not the first time Russia has demonstrated such behavior. In 2017 and 2020, similar satellites were observed either releasing objects or shadowing U.S. government satellites, leading the U.S. Chief of Space Operations at the time, General J. Raymond, to describe the behavior as unusual and disturbing. While we don't know the exact purpose of Cosmos 2558 and its sub-satellite, their actions highlight a growing set of capabilities in orbit that are drawing increased attention. Low Earth orbit. So I want to thank several of our commercial space analytics companies. We did take a little creative license because we didn't exactly see the maneuvers, but I think this is an example where we're seeing this happen fairly routinely, but I'll ask you to comment on it. But this is where space and orbital dynamics are different. So I'd really appreciate your reaction when you see something like that. What are you seeing?
It's evident. Russia was deploying a space weapon there, and they're putting it into an orbit where they can reach critical U.S. national security satellites. And if you go back to some of those early launches of that system, the Russian nesting dolls system, they were testing that. And so it would be the same as if we had a new fighter, maybe the new F-47 that the Air Force is going to acquire, with a new missile system. And we decided, instead of testing that on our test ranges back at Nevada or in Utah, that we decided to send that airplane up to Alaska. And as Russian bombers were flying patrols somewhat near our coastline, we sent this brand new F-47 up to test near a Russian bomber. It's just not the kind of thing we traditionally see. And so the Russians were testing weapons near our satellites. And now, we assess they're through testing, and now they're putting operational systems up, again, within orbit reach of our high-value satellites. So it's evident what they're doing. We maintain constant vigilance watching that.
Well, and unlike air, where you see the afterburners, can you give us a sense? As you think about the operators that are manning consoles, doing the analysis here, this is just such it's different. It's physics, but it's just different. So how do you look at? How do you think about the maneuvers, your ability to maintain awareness, your ability to maintain command and control of your things?
We have the world's best space domain awareness capabilities that we've built up over decades, but now, that's great to say we have the world's best, but is it sufficient? Because we have to be able to maintain constant custody of these threats. Because as you note, Carrie, if one of these Russian weapon systems starts to maneuver, we want to be able to detect that very quickly and be able to provide that warning to the operators of that critical national security satellite. And so making sure we have the ability to maintain custody of these threats is really important. And that's why on my integrated priority list of the gaps and capabilities we need, number 3 on that list is improved domain awareness. And I think artificial intelligence, machine learning can be very helpful in this. We want the tools that help flag for our operators, hey, something's happening, so then they can bring that human analytic judgment to figure out what it is.
And it's not just activity that we're seeing in low Earth orbit. We're seeing our adversaries also pursue technologies and experiment in geosynchronous orbit. So if I can cue up the second video, this will highlight some activities that we're seeing over the last year by China in geosynchronous orbit. China's Xijian-21 satellite first drew attention in 2022 when it captured another Chinese satellite and moved it into a graveyard orbit, a higher, out-of-the-way path used to store aging spacecraft. In the summer of 2025, Xijian-21 demonstrated a new capability. It began a carefully coordinated approach with another Chinese satellite, Xijian-25, thought to be the equivalent of a mobile gas station. Both systems operate in geosynchronous orbit, more than 22,000 miles above Earth, where satellites circle at the same rate Earth rotates, and usually appear parked over one location. Xijian-25 was launched in January 2025. According to Chinese state media, its mission is to test technologies for refueling satellites and extending their operational life. To meet up, the two spacecraft performed a slow, highly choreographed series of maneuvers, a dance of sorts, tracing looping figure-8 patterns as seen from Earth, and gradually narrowing the distance. Orbiting the Earth at speeds near 2 miles per second, they made incredibly precise adjustments to stay aligned. As they drew within about 1 kilometer, roughly 0.6 miles, ground tracking systems could no longer clearly distinguish them, and they appeared as a single object. While we can't see the exact moment of contact, available data suggests the satellites successfully docked, likely to test in-orbit refueling to extend satellite lifespans. This technology could support routine servicing and maintenance in space, but the same ability to approach and interact with another satellite also carries security implications, raising questions about how such capabilities might be used in the future.
Space operators, it's a complex operation. We've demonstrated those kind of capabilities, and in your voice track, very well done, Carrie. You highlighted the opportunity for them to extend the life of that SJ-21. But let's really think about what the SJ-21 did a few years ago when it went and grabbed a Beta Al satellite, moved it into the graveyard orbit, and then the SJ-21 came back into the geo belt. And yes, extending the life may be useful and would be useful, but this also now enables that SJ-21 to really leverage maneuver in a way maybe to go move other Chinese satellites or to perhaps be a counter space threat to our capabilities. And so that's something we are watching very closely. Does this demonstrate they're beginning to build out a maneuver warfare capability on orbit with logistics and servicing supporting infrastructure that they've now placed. That would be problematic from our perspective because the U.S. Joint Force has derived so much benefit in the other domains of having a maneuver advantage. It's really one of the hallmarks of our Joint Force, and certainly at U.S. Space Command, we think we should have that same maneuver advantage on orbit.
Well, so let's build on that. You've talked quite a bit about maneuver warfare in space. So is this a hallmark of future warfare that extends into space? Clearly, we're seeing that the Chinese and the Russians demonstrate it. So where are we in our maturation of that as a concept and then the capabilities to enable it?
Yeah, there's this paradox that if you haven't paused and really thought about what does maneuver warfare mean on orbit, you might say, hey, Whiting, everything in space is moving. It's true, but they're in almost always typically energy neutral orbits where you place them into an orbit and then Kepler's equations take over, and to move them out of that orbit that they're in takes energy, and typically that burns fuel, and we only have the fuel we launch with, and so every time you burn fuel, you're taking life off the end of the satellite. And so at U.S. Space Command, we want to get to the point where we can maneuver without regret. We can sustain space maneuver so that we can execute dynamic space operations. I've talked about this publicly over the last couple months and weeks, but later this year we're going to execute something we call Apollo maneuvers, which will be an exercise and wargaming and TTX series to go look at what would it mean for us, what are the capabilities we would need if we truly could maneuver without regret. Right now, every time we maneuver some of our most dynamic satellites, we got to have a conversation. Well, where are we on the fuel slope, and can we afford to burn that fuel? And what if, again, we didn't have those considerations? What would that mean? What would that look like? And so we're going to go test that and then see what the .mil PF considerations are. And sorry, I don't remember what .mil PF fully stands for, but it's all the supporting infrastructure, the personnel, the doctrine, the equipment, all the things you need to enable a force. Yeah.
Well, and building on that as well, several years ago, the Joint Staff released something called Joint Warfighting Concepts, or Joint Warfighting Concepts. But they talk about these principles across the Joint Force. So expanded maneuver, pulsed operations, global fire, integrated command and control, resilient logistics. So these are concepts, that the Army, the Marines, the Navy embrace. You're really thinking about space in a similar way, or at least from what I've heard you say prior. So can you unpack that a bit for us? You mentioned maneuver, but how do we think about some of these other joint warfighting concepts as they apply to the space domain?
It's a great question, and certainly we have looked deeply at the lessons that the U.S. military and certainly militaries for centuries have learned. And some of those are expressed in something that the Joint Force calls the joint functions. And these are the capabilities you need in every domain to be successful. And it's things like fires. You need the ability to affect targets. You need command and control. You need intelligence. You need to be able to protect your force. You need to be able to sustain your force. You have to be able to leverage information. And there's one more. If I didn't say intelligence, maybe I did. But there's 7 of them. And so we think we need all of those same capabilities. If the rest of the Joint Force is successful with maneuver warfare, well, and by the way, maneuver is a principle of war. We've learned this over centuries. And again, movement and maneuver is one of the joint functions. We need all those same things, those best lessons that the rest of the domains have learned in space. And this is part of a decades-long maturation of our space capabilities, from yes, enabling national security to being a place where actual combat will occur, and how do we robust ourselves to fully operate in this domain, much like we operate in the air, sea, and land.
So last week was the big space confab, the space symposium out in Colorado Springs. General and I were joking earlier that if you're a sports fan, it's like the Super Bowl. If you're an arts fan, it's like the Coachella of space events. Last year, this year you talked quite heavily about maneuver. Last year you made a comment where you basically said, it's time that we can clearly say that we need space fires, we need weapon systems, we need orbital interceptors. And what do we call these? We call them weapons. You mentioned space fires or joint fires. What does that look like in space? Why do we need to have this weapons conversation?
we have held on to a notion for many, many decades that space is this romantic place for discovery. And as I said earlier, I am so inspired by what NASA is doing. I can't wait to see, men and women walking back out on the lunar surface. And at the same time it's also now a warfighting domain. And if we're truly going to normalize, and we've said this for a long time, at least a decade now, we're going to normalize space as a warfighting domain, then we have to be able to speak clearly. And, speaking clearly is to say, I need fires, because that's what the joint functions are. I need fires in space. And what's a fire? It's a way you affect a target. How do you affect a target? With a weapon. And that can be non-kinetic, it can be kinetic, it can be, we could go through all the different descriptors there. And I think it also, by clearly stating that, it also allows us to do what our Secretary of War has called us to do, which is to revive the warrior ethos. And we've got to be able to speak plainly to our guardians, to the other members of the Joint Force that support us in space, and use the words that the rest of the Joint Force uses. And so, when I said that last year, I was just trying to use plain language to describe what it is we need. And again, I have to have the ability to affect those targets and be able to achieve the outcomes that the Joint Force needs us to achieve to be successful.
Well, and it's a sobering conversation, but as we saw visually, our adversaries are moving in that direction, and they have been really for years or for a couple decades now. The other thing that you said last week at Space Symposium that really struck me is that you said the way we fight must evolve. And thinking, we're used to satellites obeying the laws of Kepler and being fairly at least in predictable trajectories. So, given the discussion we've had so far and what we're seeing, how should space operations and warfare evolve? And really, how much of a culture shock is that to our ecosystem, whether in government and the operators or in industry?
I think, let me start with the culture shock. I certainly don't think within the U.S. military it's a massive culture shock. We've been certainly having these conversations for well over a decade. It's why President Trump in his first term stood up U.S. Space Command. It's why the Congress in President Trump's first term ultimately created the U.S. Space Force, is because we recognized this is the journey that we're on, and we need organizations optimized to be able to get after this. And I think the rest of the Joint Force recognizes this now. We don't have to go convince senior leaders in the Pentagon that space is important. We don't have to go convince senior leaders in the Congress. We just saw Chairman Rogers, maybe one of the two grandfathers of the U.S. Space Force, and he just highlighted the president's budget is going to have significant investments in space capabilities, generational investments. I think the shocking part may be publicly when we talk about this, because people don't often pause and think about the ramifications of what it means to have supremacy in space, which the president's executive order recently called for, and what it's going to require as investments to be able to do that. And I think we just need to continue to educate, but I'm excited about the path that we're on.
All right. I'm going to start weaving in a few questions because these are better than the ones that I have prepared. So we're talking about joint warfighting and integrating space. But there's a piece of this also which is integrating our allies and partners. So there's a question here from Neil Wolf at McGill University. About 1 year ago, you addressed the inaugural NATO Space Center of Excellence conference in Toulouse, France, and emphasized that space is a team sport. So how does U.S. cooperation with international partners such as Operation Olympic Defender, how has that changed in the last year? And I'll broaden it as well and tack on, how do you see our allies and partners being integrated into this joint operational environment?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Our allies and partners are really important to us for a number of reasons. And, one is the burden sharing aspect. And I mentioned missile warning earlier, Carrie. And if you go to our base that oversees that missile warning enterprise and you walk out onto the ops floor, several of our closest allies actually contribute manpower. And if you walk out onto that ops floor, it might be a Canadian captain with an American NCO, and there might be a Royal Air Force or Royal Australian Air Force flight lieutenant down on the ops floor. And then you come back another time, it'll be an American captain with an Australian NCO, and we're just integrated. So they provide manpower that help us operate that. They also provide us geographic locations where we can operate from, which gives us that ability to surveil space globally, which is really important. But we have made progress through Operation Olympic Defender, which the question asked about. That's our named operation in space. with the 3 countries I just mentioned, plus New Zealand, France, and Germany. And over the last year plus, we've really demonstrated how we can execute on-orbit operations together, do binational RPOs with our satellites, also demonstrated our ability to advance our space domain awareness as 7 nations. And I announced last week that we'll be taking the results of one of our most recent Operation Olympic Defender operations, Selene, and we'll be making that now a full-time operation. So very excited to work with those closest partners as they now have, just about every one of them has announced significant investments in space. And as they bring on new capability, how can we leverage that for the greater good of all the countries to be deconflicted, integrated, and synchronized?
And there's a few different questions here on expanding our threat discussion. So I want to go back and hit some of those. So Dr. Roberto Gamara from the New School asks, how do the American, Russian, and Chinese approaches to the strategic space domain differ? And I'm going to pair that with another question here on China consolidating much of its EW, its electronic warfare forces, under the strategic support force. So how do we look at what China and others are doing in the electronic warfare domain? And really, what does that mean for our ability to achieve superiority in the electromagnetic spectrum?
Yeah, I think Russia, let me start with Russia, has clearly watched the United States, our NATO allies, our Western allies, and has come to the conclusion that they're at a conventional arms deficit related to us. And so they're looking for novel ways to try to balance that correlation of forces, to use a Soviet term. So they're looking at nuclear, cyber, and space. And that's why when we read these reports over the last 2 years that Russia may be considering placing a nuclear ASAT on orbit, we find those just incredibly troubling. It would violate the Outer Space Treaty, to which they're a party. It would be a weapon with indiscriminate effects that would affect not only the United States, but the Chinese, the Indians, the Europeans, you name it. And so that's just an outcome that we don't want to see and couldn't tolerate. The Chinese, they have studied us deeply for 35 years, and really they're trying to replicate what we have done. And I point to typically 3 areas China is moving alarmingly fast, breathtakingly fast. But I'm going to add a 4th now. So the first is they have really built out their space capabilities at an incredible speed to make the People's Liberation Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps more lethal, precise, and far-ranging. And remember, the PLA is the Chinese Communist Party's military, not the state military of China. The second way they've moved incredibly fast is they have built a suite of counterspace weapons to hold us at risk. Everything from cyber to non-kinetic attack to high-energy lasers, direct-descent ASAT weapons, and then, as we saw in the video, co-orbital ASAT weapons as well, because they want to deny us our space capabilities. The third area is they've built a space-based targeting system to find, fix, track, and target U.S. terrestrial forces, so our Navy, our Air Force, our Marine Corps, our Army, as they maneuver in the Indo-Pacific, and then pairing that with their over-the-horizon fires, trying to hold us at risk at long range. And then the 4th area, and your video, which was very well done, Carrie, highlights this. It appears now they're starting to build out this on-orbit maneuver capability. So China is trying to leverage space for all the same advantages that we are, while demonstrating that they can hold us at risk.
I'm going to tee off of your 3rd area. They're building this large ISR architecture. I think over 500 ISR satellites that you've testified on. They're building out their versions of Starlink so they can see us and they can target us. We've talked earlier about, it's natural that a military will want to target the other side's command and control, communications, ISR early in a fight. That's what we saw Russia do as they were invading Ukraine. I think about an Indo-Pacific scenario. So much of our command and control and communications, our ISR relies on space. How are you thinking, how do we withstand that? How are you thinking about deterring that or being more resilient against those kind of threats that you just outlined from China?
Yeah, maybe deterrence is a useful framework to answer that question. There's a lot written about space deterrence, and I think that starts with clearly communicating what it is you're trying to deter. And we don't want there to be a weapon of mass destruction on orbit. We don't want our satellites to be attacked. So we've got to be able to communicate that to our opponents. Second, we need to demonstrate the resilience of our architecture to an attack so that you deny the benefit to the potential attacker. So again, they question why would they attack you. And then third, you have to have the capabilities to be able to impose costs back on them. And they have to understand that if they do the thing you've communicated you don't want done, that you have the ability to affect them. And so, that's something we seek to demonstrate every day. We have a very, very close partnership with the other combatant commands, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, as we think about the challenge of China, U.S. Cyber Command, U.S. Strategic Command, to make sure that our forces and capabilities are completely layered in to those regional plans that Admiral Paparo and his team are working. And I couldn't imagine a better partner than Admiral Paparo and his team as we work that.
He's been one of the biggest space advocates in the department.
It's incredible how sophisticated Indo-PACOM and their components are thinking about space, because they understand it's not a theoretical issue. They need U.S. space capabilities, and they need to be able to operate in the face of Chinese space capabilities. And I have been so impressed by the thinking they've done, challenged our team. We have to elevate our thinking to match their thinking in Indo-Pacific Command. But again, for those who aren't inside the U.S. government, we don't go to Indo-Pacific Command and try to convince them why this is important. Frequently, it's Admiral Paparo and others who are leading the discussion about why space is so vital to the overall joint force.
And a lot of how we demonstrate or address deterrence, we do campaigning. In other domains, you have freedom of navigation maneuvers at sea or other campaigning activities, bomber flights. So what does campaigning look like in space for Space Command? And what do we tend to misunderstand about space campaigning, I'll say?
Yeah, campaigning, I think the definition paraphrased is it's linking together military operations, activities, and investments to do three things. One is to set conditions in your AOR. And U.S. Space Command, we have responsibility for the space AOR starting 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface and then moving out from there. The second item is our second goal of campaigning is to deter conflict. And then number three is to reduce risk if we had to execute our operational plan. And so we consider a whole host of activities campaigning, like the recent operations we've done on orbit with Operation Olympic Defender, when we and our French counterparts or we and our British counterparts have demonstrated that we can do RPOs together. That demonstrates our ability to do so together, and we've done that in certain parts of the world to demonstrate we can operate over those certain parts of the world. And so that's important, but it's also interesting to note that without an on-orbit maneuver capability at scale, it constrains our ability to do campaigning again, because we always have to be making that trade-off. Hey, if we're going to maneuver these satellites for some purpose of campaigning, what's that going to do to the life of the satellites? What's that going to do to our ability to operationally employ them when needed? And so we're constantly in that dynamic. That's another reason we want to improve our ability to do on-orbit servicing and refueling, is so that we can do better training, we can do better campaigning, better testing, those kind of activities.
Well, so that's exactly where I want to go with this next question. So a friend of ours and Space Command alum, retired Colonel Dennis Willey, asks about if you can share your perspective regarding how a future in-space logistics architecture might change the way you would employ space forces.
Well, Dennis, I think I started to answer that question. Good to see you. But let me talk about one other aspect. And this is an idea that somebody introduced to me within the last year. Because we almost always only operate with the fuel that we launch with, there is a psychology of scarcity that has sat over our enterprise for decades. And that has a lot of impacts. You know, if you're a lieutenant or an 03 captain fighter pilot, you know, we're going to give you an airplane and we're going to send you cross country to train, and you're going to go, if you're a fighter pilot, you're going to go to the Nellis test range, and we're going to send you up to do big exercises, and we're going to give you those first 10 missions that we used to talk about at Red Flag. In the space domain, we can't just give our crew or captain the ability to do those kinds of things, the analogous kinds of things, on orbit if they're flying an operational SATCOM satellite or an operational GSAP satellite. Because again, we've got to be thinking about how are we husbanding the fuel to get to the end of the program life of that. And so this psychology of scarcity means we don't enable mission command the way that we could. It means we centralize decisions sometimes at a higher level, because if we're having to make a decision between training and burning the end of the life of the satellite, well, do we Do we give the captain that decision, or do we pull that up, to a colonel, to a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star? And so I think Dennis enabling better on-orbit logistics and maneuver capability allows us to really push down responsibility and authority, enable the training that perhaps we've only been able to do synthetically up till now.
You're given the keys to a Ferrari, but you only get one tank of gas.
Yeah, exactly.
It really modifies your behavior, though.
Does.
So you're right, that enables so much more to be able to pursue that kind of concept. So let me shift back here. We talked about the Chinese being able to see and others see across the battle space, much more transparent battle space. There's been a lot of discussion as of late on both the benefits and risks of proliferating commercial imagery providers. And so the question here is that while U.S. companies right now are voluntarily restricting the dissemination of regional imagery, there are others that have not been inclined to do so. And China's been out actually very publicly displaying some of their imagery that they're seeing of the Middle East. So how is commercial imagery maybe helping Space Force operations, and then how is it becoming a risk in operations?
I think we've certainly seen U.S. imagery companies have been, fantastic partners in this, trying to limit the ability of their imagery to get in the hands of our opponents. And definitely appreciate that from U.S. commercial industry. U.S. commercial space industry carries such a massive advantage for the United States. And so we, in the U.S. government, get to leverage that imagery, for example, to augment U.S. Imagery systems. And that just creates a better picture of our, where it is we're operating, what it is we're trying to do. But the fact is, there are so many imagery sources now. I think the ability to completely cut off any opponent from that is going to be very, very challenged. And so we have to understand, what does that mean for our terrestrial forces? It means if you're operating a fixed location that's within range of an opponent's strike systems, they're likely going to be able to target you. And we've seen, the success of our missile defense systems, but we've also seen how challenging it can be to try to interdict when you have hundreds of missile attacks over multiple days and one-way attack drones. So I think it's just a complete reflection of the world we live in today that we can expect the battlefield will remain transparent going forward.
Okay, one more question from the audience, and then I'll wrap up with a final question. We can't let you get away here without talking Golden Dome and space-based interceptors and really the space layer to it. So there's a question here in terms of, can you speak to the progress of Golden Dome? But then I'll build on that and ask you to talk about what Space Command's role is, and how do you envision Space Command working with NORTHCOM or other commands that will likely have responsibilities in this area?
I'll certainly let General Gutlein, the direct reporting program manager for Golden Dome, talk about the progress, and he's been on Capitol Hill recently talking about that. We are in full lockstep with him and with U.S. Northern Command, and you asked, Carrie, about what is U.S. Space Command doing. Going back to the executive order, the president in the executive order for Golden Dome, this visionary call to arms to be able to protect our citizenry here in the United States from these modern threats we now face. He talked about the importance of the space-based layer for tracking, and he talked about space-based interceptors. And certainly because that's our AOR at Space Command, we expect to have responsibility for those systems, and it's why we partnered with U.S. Northern Command to write the requirements document that went up through the Joint Requirements Oversight Council last year. And now we're partnering again with them to write concept of operations for how the space layer will fold into the other layers of Golden Dome. And just could not have a better partnership with General Gutlein, General Gio, and their teams to make sure that we can deliver this as the President's executive order calls for.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. As an area that we'll continue to watch and engage on closely. Okay, last thoughts from you. I want to shift to, this is a really big year. It's our 250th birthday as a nation. And for those that did not get to see General Whiting's comments last week at Space Symposium, you very much talked about that theme and really what it means for space. But we've only been in space, I did a little bit of the math, we've only been in space about 70 of those 250 years. So I'm going to break the history down here in terms of General Whiting's epics. I'm going to say 3 epics in space. The first epic, Cold War epic. You had Sputnik, Corona, Apollo. We were just early in the inception of our use of space and our space technology. My second epic, this is the General Whiting epic. Lieutenant Whiting commissioned in the U.S. Air Force in 1989, and I think about what were we doing in space in 1989? 1990 was your first operational space assignment. I think it was the Space Warning Squadron. That was the year that we launched Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm, which has been called by many the first space war, first time we used space in a conflict. So we're kind of at this transition point now, right? This third epic of space. And we've been fortunate over the years to engage with many university students, undergrad masters, many cadets that are now starting to commission into the Space Force and other services. So can you reflect for a moment, what does this third epic look like for those cadets getting ready to commission, and any advice that you'd give them as we look forward here?
Yeah, first, I wish I was young again. This is an amazing epic that young people are entering into if they want to be a space professional, whether uniformed or serving elsewhere in the government or serving in commercial industry. You know, there's a law, I think it's called Amara's Law, that says in the short term, we overestimate the amount of technological change. And so sometimes that leads to us being disappointed. You know, we hear about, well, why aren't there self-driving cars yet? Why aren't there humanoid robots? But in the long term, we underestimate that. And so the world is going to look fundamentally different, I think, in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. Some of the technologies I just mentioned, but we're going to have a lunar base. That's only the stepping stone out to the broader solar system, out to the asteroids, out to Mars. And think about what that really means for a second. You know, today, it's such a thrill to get to interact with our astronauts. They really are the best of us. You know, it's almost like you go to central casting and you say, you know, deliver me the astronaut. And whether a man or a woman, they walk out and they all look the part, they talk the part, they're brilliant, they're all incredible. In the next couple of decades, we're going to send not dozens of astronauts, maybe not even hundreds, thousands of people are going to have the opportunity. And it's going to be every trade we can think of. You know, how do you sustain a lunar base? You're going to have plumbers, electricians. You're going to have the guy or gal who runs the comm system, you know, who runs the electrical grid. And that's going to be an opportunity that you know, future generations are going to have. And what does that mean for us in the military? It remains to be seen a little bit, but if history is a guide, and we know that Clausewitz gave us maybe the best expression in the Western world of how we think about warfare, he said that warfare is politics by other means. And where people go, politics ensues, and then warfare and tension might come. And that's the history we saw of the maritime world. Trade started over the oceans, and piracy started. Eventually, countries developed a navy, and the countries that had the best navy could secure their lines of communication, and they became the richest, most powerful countries. You know, just think about the Royal Navy as the wooden wall of the United Kingdom for so many centuries. Well, if we start to see that dynamic play out in orbit as we're leveraging the moon, leveraging the asteroids for commercial development, we're going to need potentially a military that can secure those space lines of communication. And so for young military professionals going into space, I think it's going to be incredibly exciting. Most of those missions will happen from planet Earth, but I think it's very possible we'll have a need to have uniformed guardians and maybe other members of the joint force executing military missions on orbit. And that's an incredibly exciting future.
Hard to imagine, but
Yeah.
to your point, it's going to be here in the next years, decades to come. Well, General, I want to thank you so much. One, thank you for the clarity that you provided on the trends, the challenges, and the opportunities in this area. Two, for guiding the command and really us as a nation at such a pivotal point with the use of space and challenges to space. But then lastly, for leading all the men and women in uniform and the civilians who do this mission every day. So it's been tremendous talking to you. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask everyone to just take a few minutes here. We'll take about 5 minutes. We're going to reset the stage here, and we'll bring on our next terrific panel to continue this discussion. But General, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carrie.
Okay.
Please, come on.
All right.
You're the governor.
All right.
You're
Okay.
front stage.
All right.
I'm just a former. You give me this high sign when we're ready to go. Okay. Welcome to the strategic panel on essentially space warfighting. So I'm Scott Stapp. I'm a senior advisor here for Carrie at CSIS. And we're going to do a continuation of essentially, General Whiting did a great job of laying out not only how fast space is moving, but how complex space is becoming. So we're going to have the panel here dive a little bit deeper into those questions. We're going to really break space into two pieces. One is when you talk about space warfighting, one is how do you support the warfight from space, so for the ground forces, and then the second one is how do you actually conduct the warfight in space. So before we get into the questions, I want to introduce the panel, and I'm going to let them kind of go a little bit 2 to 3 minutes apiece, introduce their backgrounds, and a little bit about how they're thinking about this problem. So to my left, I have Tony Frazier, CEO of LeoLabs. And then Evan Rogers, CEO of True Anomaly. Actually, I'm going to go to Mike Gancio, who's next. He's the professional staff member of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And then Chirag Parikh. So I don't know, and again, I think most folks know Chirag, although it says here he is the Indutara Space LLC. I think most folks know him as the secretary for when he was at the White House for the National Space Council. So with that, I'm going to turn over Tony and tell us your background and a little bit about what you think about space warfighting and anything you want to talk about General Whiting stock.
Yeah, thanks. So Tony Frazier, CEO of LeoLabs. LeoLabs, our vision is to be the leading source of persistent orbital intelligence for space domain awareness, space traffic management, and missile defense. I think we do that through a global sensor network that is based on the ground. So we have 11 active radars across 7 locations around the world. And we built that system to really maintain custody of what we saw as the emerging trends, in space. And so building on General Whiting's comments, in low Earth orbit, we saw this massive investment in commercial capabilities that led to a growth in the total number of objects being tracked from about 900 in 2016 to over 14,000 satellites today, and over 27,000 objects that we're tracking today. And I think in terms of some of the themes that were covered earlier, we've seen the environment become much more congested, contested, but also competitive, which is driving a change in requirements. And so when General Whiting referenced the integrated priority list and this need to have enhanced battle space awareness for space operations, we need to move from an environment where we're getting a handful of measurements a day for those objects in low Earth orbit to be able to maintain persistent custody of those objects. And so that's really what's driving a lot of our evolution at LeoLabs, where instead of being able to get a measurement a day to predict an orbit, we want to be able to maintain constant custody of those objects, increasingly from adversarial nations. And so a lot of the investments we're making to proliferate our next generation sensors, which then allow us to be able to get constant measurement, to detect, track, and characterize those threats, we think is really important. And when you think about the threat going from a very low Earth orbit, out, to cislunar, I think we as an industrial base need to come together, to be able to, provide that constant surveillance, which then can be applied, in a much more, tactical mission.
Thank you. Evan? I'm Evan Rogers. I'm the CEO and co-founder of True Anomaly. I'll start with my background. I started True Anomaly 4 years ago after a 10-year career in the Air Force. And I was one of those young officers that General Whiting was talking about that lived through the weaponization and the militarization of the space domain in the modern era. And I had a front row seat to that transformation. I was in the Air Force, and then I went into the Space Force and served the last couple of years of my career in the United States Space Force. As an Air Force officer, I was an Air Force weapons officer. So my responsibility was to be a tactical expert and a tactical leader for joint fires in the space domain. And these were concepts and ideas in space that you had to say in very sort of hushed corners in public settings, but largely only in classified settings. And so it's been gratifying and incredible to watch this rhetorical transformation and conceptual transformation happen in front of our eyes, and now we can have these open strategic dialogues. The core observation that led to True Anomaly was that space warfighting technologies are downstream of operational concepts. And the operational concepts that are starting to emerge necessitate that we build dedicated warfighting platforms for space. You'll hear me maybe talk about the death of dual use for space superiority. That's going to be one of my controversial and hopefully interesting takes today. But True Anomaly is all about building warfighting capability for the United States and its allies. So we spend all of our capital and all of our talent and all of our time thinking about how to build and building the most lethal and combat effective space systems and the training capabilities that are necessary for the United States to protect and defend itself in space, but more importantly, to deny our adversaries the use of space for, as General Whiting said, targeting of terrestrial forces and the denial of the US's abilities to use space. The only thing I'll emphasize maybe from General Whiting's speech is that maneuver warfare isn't necessarily about maneuver. Maneuver warfare is a concept. It relies on the movement of objects in space and time to a position of advantage. I'm not stating that he's conflating these two things at all. He's obviously an expert in joint warfighting. But the fundamental concepts that the space domain space warfighters are starting to bring into the conversation are not new. We're starting from first principles of what it means to do warfighting, and now with an abundance mindset, with a growth mindset, we're unleashed to have really interesting conversations and develop critical technologies that will defend the United States and its allies. And quite literally what we're talking about is defending and protecting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and sailors and airmen from space-enabled attack, and that's a righteous mission.
Thanks. Mike?
Hey, Mike Gancio. I'm currently the Director of Analysis at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. I'll be brief. I don't nearly have the expertise these gentlemen do. But I've been looking at space now over the course of my career, mostly from a threat perspective. And what we've seen, the general laid out, so I think he said it better than any of us will, the threat has almost gone parabolic over the last few decades, and now we're at a crucial juncture. So that's whether it's on the committee here where I currently sit, or my job previous to this was in the intelligence community as an analyst looking at space and counter space threats. It's very evident, and it's a forum like this is a privilege to participate in because we're now able to discuss a lot of the threats that previously, to Evan's point, were not well discussed publicly, and there just wasn't a lot of material that we could talk about. And now we've got fancy videos and plenty of evidence that we can point to in official government publications or think tanks like CSIS put out great annual threat reports. So that's been my focus here is really on the threat. And I'll leave it to the much smarter folks of what we do about it. I like to point out the problems. I'll leave it to Chirag to tell us how to solve it.
All right, thanks, Mike. Chirag?
Yeah, I think I've had a front row seat on this topic now for almost 30 years. Similar, to a lot of people here, I started in the government. I started, I think many of you know me, as Scott was saying, as the White House guy, Space Council and National Security Council. But my career actually began doing scientific and technical intelligence of foreign space and counter space systems, similar to Mike. Different organization, but similar concepts along the way. I had the opportunity to help shape and inform national policies because of these threats in 2010. A lot of this begins in about not just the Chinese ASAT test, but also in 2010 policy discussions along the way. I had the opportunity after Security Council, and huge classified investments in budget in the 16 through 20 budget bill that has sustained now through 3 administrations and hopefully will continue forward along the way. And what you see is the threat is outpacing the capability right now. And so when I went over back into the intelligence community to run collection operations for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, it showed just how dynamic and complex this environment now is. Then, out of just sheer morbid curiosity, I decided, let's see what it feels like to be in the private sector and work with the government. And boy, that's hard. Yeah, you guys are right. I have to admit that. The government does not make it easy to work with them on particular novel topics now, like space control with the commercial sector and the international sector. I hope to talk about that. But then I think the last job really shaped, holistically as the executive secretary of the National Space Council, because this is no longer just a military for military thing. This is no longer just national security Title 10, Title 50. This is really the Venn diagram of civil, commercial, national security, space capabilities overlaid on allied civil, commercial, and national security capabilities. And to be able to weave those elements together is really essential for us to be able to operate in this new environment that we've heard General Whiting talk about recently.
No, thank you. So as I said, as I start these questions, we're going to break this into 2 pieces. One is, how do you support the warfight from space? And then how do you basically conduct the warfight in space? And some of the questions will be generic. You can answer them both. We can talk a little bit and cross the boundaries. But what I am going to do is key off a little bit of what General Whiting talked about when he talked about the U-2 getting shot down. Because again, it's interesting that history tends to repeat itself as we switch domains from air to space. When the U-2 got shot down, it was actually an intelligence platform. Right, it was run by the intelligence community. When the department, with all of its money, decided, well, in ISR there's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and the department does a lot of surveillance and reconnaissance, rather than having 3 U-2s like the intelligence community had, they decided to buy 100. Right, a lot of money, they made it surveillance and reconnaissance, and they pushed it that way. I think everybody here knows that they've started, other platforms have become at risk in the fight. We are sunsetting J-STARS, and it is moving to space in a GMTI world, right? They're starting to look at AWACS, so a lot of other airplanes are struggling, and they're moving into this space domain. The ISR world has typically, over the last 40 years, been dominated by the intelligence community. The department is now looking into that and is finding they need it to do strategic warfighting and the missions of these other assets. So with that said, how do we look at the integration of Title 10, Title 50, really DOD or DOW and IC, and then how do we look at adjusting the policies, operations, acquisitions to make that more seamless? What are those barriers that you guys see to making that more effective? I know in the end, if you guys don't talk, Chirag's going to talk.
I'm giving you guys a chance. Okay, I'll start. Look, having lived in both communities, and having helped support now commercial entities along the way as well, the cultural element is a very interesting one. And I think it's a solvable one, to be quite honest. And I think it comes down to timelines. The intelligence community has often worked on longer timelines. The intelligence community has worked at higher classification levels and protected their secrets because of sources and methods, as obvious. Department of Defense often lives at the unclassified level in CIPRNet, particularly at joint operations around the world, participating with allies and partners. And so being able to change the culture of how quickly you need speed is one thing. Then another thing on the policy side of things, I think it's classification policy, and in 2 different areas. One is on the threat side. So Mike talked about the fact that now more and more information is publicly available about just broadly communicating the threats out there. For a lot of the different international dialogues that I've led, we have talked about it in classified channels about the threats along the way with our allies and partners. Now being able to have reports like CSIS and these types of panels talk about these threats, I think is important. But similarly, while often, I'm going to put my IC hat on, while often the complaint is about we can't talk about the threats, the DoD hasn't done much self-service as well. There are a number of capabilities within the Department of Defense that sit at varying classification levels that have been brick and mortared into security classification guidance, SCGs, along the way. Scott ran all of these along the way. I think it's your fault. We'll begin the firing now. But I think this is the challenge, which is in order for us to be able to get these types of capabilities out to the joint force, out to allies and partners, out to partnerships with commercial, the classification guidance policy, which initiated 4 or 5 years ago now and is being continued, needs to continue to evolve along the way.
No, that's great. And you brought up another one, which is I think commercial and international are obviously going to be critical as we go forward. But there's question marks about how do you integrate commercial and international when you look at varying classification levels, when you're talking about ensuring trusted data. How do you look at commercial and international integrating in with these national capabilities?
I mean, I think the general's example with Operation Olympic Defender, and if you've been to a combatant command watch for, it's very helpful, and that's where the Title 10 culture can help a Title 50 IC who's traditionally very US-only centric, no foreign classification, right? When you have a joint military element with our allies and partners operating together day to day, by default, then you're sort of forced to operate at a level that's more releasable. And that's it. It's mostly a culture. There's IT networks. That's always going to be, sort of the long pole in the tent is how do you make the computers talk to each other at the right classification. But when the default, and that's the sort of top-down guidance is, you need to produce information that we can share with so-and-so at a certain level, and that's the marching orders. The bureaucracy will adapt. So I agree. It's mostly a cultural, and you need a forcing function, and I think having integrated allies with us helps force that. The IT will follow behind, and sometimes that, I can attest personally, it is frustrating when you have information that you just can't get it onto another computer, right? I mean, those happen. That's a solvable problem.
Security is a big challenge, but defendability is also going to emerge as a serious challenge. And I think Tony's probably in one of the best positions to speak to like the operational integration of SDA data with traditional military and intelligence sensors and how that's used. But for our part, I think there's a question mark as to whether Spacecom is going to defend commercial assets. Now, they've said it from a rhetorical standpoint that it is on the table as a thing to go do. But unless an asset is on the CAL or on the DAL, the defended asset list or critical asset list, it's not going to be defended. And we've seen this in the Iranian conflict play out a couple of times. We're talking about civilian infrastructure being targeted, but some of that infrastructure actually is on the DAL in the Middle East. So the United States is responsible for, along with its allies in the states there, to protect oil, to protect civilian infrastructure, in Qatar in particular. Translate that to space, that becomes incredibly complex in a low munitions, low density defendability environment where almost certainly the first shots against space assets are actually going to be against commercial partners. And commercial partners also need to come along, and this is like space warfare, I think John Klein said this, like is it sort of the obvious domain, especially in a contemporary conflict or a contemporary environment for irregular warfare. Warfare below armed conflict, but the shooting fight, if you will. But cyber and electronic warfare and directed energy always are sort of where, and those are the systems that our adversaries are using against our commercial partners. And by the way, they're using them today against commercial partners. There's a question about whether they need to defend themselves, and there's a question as to whether there's sufficient integration at the planning and the op-board level to say, okay, I need a Maxar spacecraft, I need a such and such spacecraft to be on the no-kidding DAL because it's providing critical warfighting functions. By the way, as soon as you do that, you signal to your adversary that it's an important asset, and it sort of goes up their list from a joint integrated priority and targeting standpoint.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I mean, what I would just add is that it's important in this relationship to build trust, and that only happens through kind of deep shoulder-to-shoulder engagement. And so I definitely think that the initiatives like the Commercial Integration Cell, which has been incubated out of Space Force's space, provides a forum for commercial providers to be in the right classification levels and environments to be able to share threat intelligence. That was a great place to start. things that we're doing now to extend that into active engagement and exercises and war games, I think shows, kind of what would be the con ops, for, if commercial was targeted, how we then would respond, to that. But I think a kind of a broader topic, which, taking a page out of my days focused on the geospatial intelligence mission, is when you're working to build a sustained relationship with the U.S. government, it's not just about kind of collecting what you believe is exquisite data. It's having the functional manager do the validation and verification of it to show that it's really fit for use, for different missions. And so, work we did at the time to be able to, not just verify the resolution, but the location, the accuracy, of the data, both in an enhanced form as well as in a processed form. That was really critical to be able to say that commercial imagery could be leveraged as part of a targeting operation versus just supporting a foundational mapping mission. I think there's a lot of parallels with what we're going to need in space. So just like there's a lot of the things that we did with NGA at the time that then fed into what it was MIDB and is now Mars in terms of providing a foundational intelligence or order of battle capability. I think going to extend to space. We need to be able to understand that the not only kind of where something is, but what it is, the attributes of it, the locational accuracy, so that it can be leveraged in more of an offensive capacity. And so having the relationships with who plays that role as a functional manager to be able to assess commercial imagery during times of peace, so that as we move to crisis and conflict, it can be trusted at the time. I think that's super important. To Evan's point, we need to be integrated into the operational systems. It can't be something that's just off to the side. It needs to be deeply integrated into the same environment that all the national sensors are also feeding, so that it can be delivered to the hands of the warfighter.
That's good. Anything, Chirag?
I'm just going to ask a question more than anything, but you brought up Tony brought up the commercial integration cell. Right now, it seemed to be mostly commercial, purely commercial, almost a sandbox type of environment. Where do you see that next step about maybe integrating? And there's so much good stuff going in there, and it's such a great construct, but it seems to be now its own isolated ecosystem, separate from the integrated joint warfighting system that you guys have been talking about. So what do you think is that next step to be able to have, bring that commercial layer in there?
Yeah, I think one of the initiatives, the conversations we've been having with the Space Force around their CASR effort, I think has been instructive about where they want to go. And in terms of deeper integration, this is where you need to look at where the architecture is leading. So if you look at the way that the BMC-3I, so the Battle Management Command Control, Communication and Space Intelligence, that PAE, that kind of falls within the Space Force, they're looking at how do we ingest commercial directly into the architecture. So if Atlas is going to be the system, for maintaining that space order battle, it needs to be not just kind of fueled by government sensors and then disseminated out to the community. Like, we need to integrate commercial as far upstream as possible. So I think that's
I've
one
heard
example.
that for the past decade.
I think we're making progress
Okay.
on it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I think this is going to kind of go to what Carrie is talking to Joel Whiting about, is about space and dogfighting, and how does this work in space? I think the corollary between what they call the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, which is aircraft that we actually take from the commercial world and we actually push them into the warfight for whether it's primarily for mobility, they can go anywhere. When you start talking about CASR, right, which is the Commercial Augmentation Space Reserve, it becomes more difficult to do this, and I think this is where Chirag's going, which is the architectures typically have to be designed and built in such a way because you can't burn a lot of fuel. So if you're not already built into the architecture to cover the pieces you need as they start to look at how they do pass-offs for targeting, how does commercial play into that over time? And if they do, can you fulfill your commercial mission at the same time you're going to have to fulfill a department or a military mission into the future? And I think I think it's more complex than the craft, but it's still a doable do. I mean, Tony, I don't know if you've thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that where we've started is the legacy sensor network that supports this mission, at least from the space domain awareness standpoint, is a space surveillance network, and this is a kind of a network of ground-based sensors, both optical and radar, that have supported both the monitoring of the space domain, but also much of our missile warning and tracking architecture. And so the approach we've taken is to look at where are there geographic gaps in coverage, if you want to be able to maintain persistent custody, of all those objects that are growing threats. Whether it's to be able to maintain custody of counter space assets that China and Russia are flying, or if you want to be able to, be in a position to counter the ISR fleets, that are rapidly expanding. And so, we've been working to build capability that can fill those geographic gaps to be able to maintain custody. But then, we need to be able to open up the interfaces, so that we can be able to apply those sensors in an operationally relevant timeline. And so a lot of the things we've been engaging with the CASR team on has been, how that ConOp would work, how you'd be able to kind of quickly pivot from, a commercial, tracking mission to be able to be leveraged, as an extension of the architecture.
CASR is a really important concept, but I think the Space Force is still in the early days of thinking through what its real limitations are. There are some important lessons learned from CRAF, particularly in the 1970s. Excuse me if I get the decade wrong here. TWA was one of the major participants in CRAF, and they modified about a half dozen Boeing 747s to support with kind of heavier duty landing gears and a fuselage that allowed them to carry much larger. And these are modified passenger jets that then became freight liners to support basically moving huge, really heavy equipment into theater. And those assets were underutilized by CRAF, and it ended up resulting in a pretty significant loss for TWA. Those assets were unusable for commercial use cases because the amount of excess fuel and the reduced payload carrying capacity for moving passengers resulted in the economics being upside down on those systems. And there's a couple of other examples in the history of craft that are interesting that you can point to like that. And I think we're going to start, the Space Force's challenge, strategic challenge for CASR is to figure out where it makes sense to leverage commercial and where it makes sense to leverage the larger, broader industrial base. And I think the Space Force has a tendency to conflate those two. They think commercial is industry. Commercial is services and capabilities generally provided, commercially owned, commercially operated, and sold wholesale or data to the United States government for consumption. Industry, defense industrial base is much broader than commercial. We're selling units of combat capability to the to the services. And I think what we're seeing now is the Space Force come to terms with the reality that there's a role for commercial, but what they actually need is a scalable defense industrial base that can respond with warfighting capabilities, not just as an augmentation, but is really the development of new fleets of warfighting systems.
Yeah, I think craft is still in its nascency along the way. And, I know we have a lot of software and hardware people in this audience here, but I will argue maybe the most important people to help shape craft are going to be your contract managers and your lawyers. And I mean this because there's the constructs that Evan is talking about, but there's also who has command authority and when? Okay, you're now part of this craft construct. You are now a legitimate target to in the eyes of an ally, to an adversary. What about liability? What about indemnification? When I was at Space Council, there was a very large debate about indemnification along the way, and we had different departments and agencies have differing perspectives on this. So a lot of these foundational, contractual, legal elements need to be ironed out as they kind of set the baseline for all these different operational environments that these guys are talking
And a
about.
major insurance provider just pulled wartime coverage from their space offering.
Just like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just zoom us out. I'm not a lawyer, not a business background, but what I do know is the threat. And if you think about sort of what's the problem that a civil space reserve would look to solve? And I think Evan hit on it, but it's more than just one problem. It's capacity on demand, and that sort of goes into requirements, because in a conflict scenario or even a crisis, you could imagine the number of things that you'd want to image from space is going to increase dramatically. And so you're going to want a surge capability. On the other hand, we've heard about, and there's plenty of material out there, the threat is rising. So you also want redundancy built into the system, and I would say extra capacity to backfill any attrition that you take to government or first line commercial systems. So that's really the problem you want to get after, is just you need more kit at a time and place that you're never going to really predict it. Because a lot of what we design and build and generate requirements is sort of the analogy to logistics is like just-in-time delivery, right? So when you build a system that's perfectly tuned and optimized to a set of requirements, the adversary gets a vote, and you're never going to know when that curveball gets thrown. So having excess capacity available, whether it's through the Civil Space Reserve fleet or just our commercial sector in general, really helps make that problem more solvable.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would just add though is that the con-op of it just being a surge capability where industry is going to build a capability and just wait for potential activation, like that business case won't close, right? So I think that part of what we're all working to do is how do we take what we know is this parabolic growth of the threat and identify how does that align to enduring COCOM requirements. What General Whiting said, his AOR is 100 kilometers and up, right? And then how does that also map to what we see as kind of enduring Space Force requirements. And so what General Saltzman shared, kind of the trend lines in the future operating environment, as well as the objective force design, it's showing that this threat is not going away, right? Today we have in the 12 to 14,000 active payloads in low Earth orbit. It's going to be north of 40,000. We estimate it'll be up to 70,000 in the next 5 years. And if all those active payloads can do maneuver without regret, if that's a trend, that means we're going to need a more robust set of capabilities. And so I think part of the way we're approaching it, CASR is a contractual mechanism, to be able to go from a base service level to an augmented service level. It's not an optional way to just potentially activate the industrial base in a time. It's a break glass during a time of conflict, and I think getting aligned on what that kind of sustained warfighter requirement means in terms of sustained funding to address that requirement, and how the mix of spend needs to go from the kind of traditional industrial base to new providers that are able to move quickly to address these gaps. And I think that's a lot of where we're going as a community.
All right, so I'm going to now transition this back into the warfight in space, and ideally the warfight in space doesn't happen, right? But as you have conflicts with near peers and they realize how much you rely on space, there is a high likelihood that will escalate to space. When you look at how much money we've put into terrestrial fighting to do surveillance and reconnaissance and understanding, whether it's airborne or space, it is over the decades, it's in the trillions. To understand our adversary, understand their capabilities, understand where they're at. When you now flip that upside down and you start talking about a warfight in space, and space domain awareness becomes an absolutely essential part of that fight. I don't think we've spent anywhere near that kind of capability to do that. When you look at just terrestrially, air is tough to surveil. Maritime, we still don't have maritime dominant surveillance. So when you start looking at space, which is significantly more vast, how do we start looking at closing that gap on space domain awareness so you can identify and track those threats? And then how do you do attribution for those threats? How do you start understanding deterrence and attribution in that environment?
Tony, you start. You're the space
I'd say you are,
guy.
yeah.
Okay, happy to kick off. So yeah, I think one of the ways we've worked to get after this is to look at how do we invert the cost curve, on this. And so, again, traditionally this mission has been addressed through large exquisite sensors. These are billion-dollar to multi-hundred-million-dollar systems where they're extremely proficient, but they're expensive to build and maintain. And so we've been very focused on, if you need to proliferate coverage to be able to maintain custody, you have all these threats where you can, for any launch, be able to detect, track those launches, both in terms of the launch plus all the payloads that are deployed from those systems, as well as be able to maintain custody to be able to see the types of activities. So things like rendezvous, proximity operations, secondary deployments, things of that nature. You need to be able to get your cost per sensor down, so you can proliferate coverage. So similar patterns we've seen in low Earth orbit, looking down, we need to be able to do the same thing, from the ground. And so, as an example, the investment we made in our Scout class of system, which is a initial prototype we built on a truck. We've now kind of moved, to a 20-foot ISO shipping container. That system, we're able to, for the cost of one of these large exquisite systems, we could build dozens, of these systems that could be proliferated, around the world to be able to maintain custody of, those types of ISR assets, that were being highlighted. So I think, we play in that detect, track, and early phase of characterization. I think a lot of what you're doing, which would, allow you to be able to get, higher fidelity, understanding of the threat and action on it, is how we would contribute.
It's really in the function of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And one of the things that Tony's really pulling at is you have to do all of those things. You have to surveil, you have to understand what's there, you have to perform reconnaissance, you need to understand its capabilities, vulnerabilities, limitations, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and intent. And that means that you need a architecture that is multi-phenomenology. You need passive optical systems in multiple wavelengths. You need active systems like radar, ground-based radar. You need space-based radar. And you also need cameras on engines. So you need systems that can maneuver around in space and go where the adversary is. And you need to be able to do that responsibly. So right now, if an adversary launches something into space, particularly into deep space, it's likely going to be months until we can get a good image of that. And that image is going to be low quality, particularly in XGEO. And we're going to get surveillance, but we're not going to get reconnaissance. And so, as Tony pointed out, the trick here is to invert the cost curve. You need to get cost per meter per second down, and that's at the platform level, which means you need to be able to get where the adversary is with a lot of thrust and a lot of acceleration, and you need a ton of capability on orbit or responsively to be able to get, again, wherever the adversary goes, from LEO to MEO to GEO to cislunar. There's not any one Uber system, just Uber surveillance or reconnaissance system. There's not any, just like there's not any one offensive Uber weapon. It is a combined arms problem. It's a multi-phenomenology problem. And just to put it in perspective, the United States Air Force, since its founding, has spent $10 trillion on air superiority platforms. $10 trillion. The United States Space Force is going to have to make the same level of investment. I know that sounds maybe a little odd sitting from where we are today, but if space is really a warfighting domain and you start to expand your imagination about what's possible, then surveillance is the foundation of combat capability, and you're going to need hundreds of billions over the next several decades, if not trillions, in a broad surveillance capability that's from, by the way, from VLEO as well, into low Earth orbit, MEO, GEO, cislunar, and beyond.
Well, I can even go lower. I think the stratospheric operations also is a unique domain to think about too. But let me flip the flipping for a second here. Last I checked, the Space Surveillance Network, all the terrestrial space domain awareness sensors are not going to tell me where and when I'm going to get jammed. Are not going to tell me when a high energy laser or low power laser is going to lase my optics. is not going to give me indications and warning of a direct descent ASAT preparing to launch on orbit. Now, all these capabilities that these gentlemen are talking about are absolutely essential for the war in space. But the war doesn't just come from space to space. It also comes from the ground. We see normalization of jamming happening in the Middle East as we speak right now. And it's not just because of the Iranian conflict. It's been happening before that as well. And so to me, space domain awareness is as much looking down as it is looking up. And where you're going to get those investments are going to be often from this guy's coffers now, from the budget on the intelligence community side. And while we often put a gigantic generalistic term for intelligence, there's actually 3 different phases. There might be 4, but I'm just going to go with 3 right now. There's the world that we grew up in, which is the scientific and technical intelligence community, to be able to provide the attribution, the capability, the knowledge to our acquisition community years, maybe even a decade in advance, how high, how far, how fast, how lethal, how vulnerable along the way. Then when I was at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, as well as our sister agency, NSA, that's more about the indications and warning. When you see this up, this over here, and this over here, that's likely this is going to happen. But if this thing isn't here, then it won't happen. And then you have the tactical and operational intelligence community, the twos, at the combatant command, to say, now that I know the capability that we've been talking about for a decade, I know where all these pieces, parts are now in play and what they do and those actions. Now that I see that, now I can provide, capabilities for offensive and defensive space control to be able to take action along the way. And to me, there's this great, huge investment that's going into the military space of things. My only concern is not to replicate capabilities and needs that are already being developed in a different domain that has that expertise along the way, that needs to have better Title 10, Title 50 integration along the way.
That sounds good.
Risk of stating the obvious. I mean, it's a tough problem, right? And I think what you've heard a lot focuses on the technology, but I would just bring it back. It also takes people, training, and we talked about culture earlier, because a lot of this, whether it's fusing together sensors, commercial sensors with government, or to Chirag's point, fusing together the very strategic long-term intelligence of, I've been looking at this weapon system for 5 years with a watch for of, well, when's it going to attack us? We need to know the tactics and procedures that are going to be diagnostic of an attack versus testing. A lot of it comes down to people, and that's not something that's easily developed overnight. A lot of this technology, we can make investments in surge, and certainly this year's budget does that in the right places, but people take a long time to grow in the expertise, both on the IC side and the military side. So I would just frame that as an important thing to consider here as you think about doing this. And AI will help. Certainly, that will help us get there, but you're going to need a person who's skilled in, whether it's in the technology for deep, what I'd call foundational intelligence, but also what's new and much harder, I'd argue, is the operational and campaign level intelligence of just how all these threat systems are going to work together. Because whether it's on orbit, ground-based, there are a lot of different threats, and it's not apparent how they're all going to work together. I mean, I think you could make cases of why are they developing this threat system? Doesn't seem that effective. It's hard to know until they use it in anger how it's going to work and how it's going to work together. So technology will get us there, but it really is going to take a skilled workforce of analysts, military professionals, commercial, to think about how all this melds together into a space warfighting picture. Hopefully we never find the right answer to that, right? Deterrence hopefully works, but you have to keep thinking about this.
Okay, like you just brought up, so since we're talking whether it's space domain awareness, whether it's supporting the warfight from space, fighting it in space, for the whole group, what are the critical technologies we need to look at? And you already mentioned one, which is AI, but how does that work? And what are the other critical technologies that enable us to actually maintain some level of superiority in space?
I'll start. I think what you heard General Whiting talk about. I think there is a desire to grow capabilities in the traditional domains within Space Force. And it's an intuitively obvious thing that we have to do, from proliferated SATCOM to proliferated ISR to missile warning support, Golden Dome, as well as conventional conflict along the way. I think a more resilient PNT. And those are the higher level things. But there has been a historic underinvestment in how you want to call it, space mobility and logistics, in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing along the way. And just as you would not send a B-2 from Missouri and say, oh, sorry, you can only get as far as the Atlantic, and then you got to come back because you don't have refueling, we've kind of focused on the refueling thing, and I think that's fantastic. And I think that's the most urgent need along the way. But I'm hoping that where Space Force now creates, I think, S9, the Futures Command capacity, I hope you have people who are thinking about all these new technologies, about nuclear propulsion, and about going between different orbits. We talked about cislunar, so different areas for domain awareness. We think about in-space manufacturing, where I don't need to worry about the size of the fairing of the launch vehicle anymore. I just need to get raw material, whether from Earth or from other sources, and I can just make that in space, where I can do in-space repair and assembly, where I don't have to just gut something because one small actuator failed. There is a whole area, a mission set that exists in every domain, whether we're talking Army for tanks, we're talking ship repairs, we're talking air mobility and logistics. All of those domains have those capabilities, and they should be replicated in space.
I'm a knuckle dragger, so I like to work from the target backwards. The purpose of the Space Force is space superiority. That means they require weapons, and they require countermeasures, and they require self-protection, other self-protection technologies. Weapons come in a lot of forms. There are kinetic weapons, non-kinetic weapons. The Space Force is going to need a wide variety of them, including cyber weapons. They're going to need low debris generating or non-debris generating systems. That seems to be the area of priority. And those weapon systems are going to be across really three engagement phenomenologies. So they're going to need surface-to-space weapons. They're going to need space-to-space weapons, because our adversaries will put capabilities beyond the reach of warfighting systems, and they will eventually need space-to-ground weapons. Space is the high ground. It is the ultimate high ground, and it provides you with overmatch from a momentum and a kinematic standpoint that is incredibly valuable for striking targets, either from an electronic warfare standpoint or kinetically in the upper atmosphere or down to the surface of the Earth. As the air domain becomes increasingly contested, long-range munitions, particularly those built by Russia and China, hypersonic weapons, we are not going to be able to get surveillance assets and strike assets anywhere close to the South China Sea in particular, and especially in a Russia conflict as well. We will increasingly see the development of weapons placed in space, conventional weapons placed in space, for strikes, in my view, this is just my view, in the terrestrial domain. You'll need to look no further, by the way, than the 2040 vision that General Saltzman has laid out. He has specifically called out the United States Space Force. I know this can feel a little uncomfortable to folks because you grew up in a world of 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It doesn't govern the deployment of conventional weapons, by the way, in the space domain. But we think that space is a peaceful domain, a peacetime domain. It's not, as we know now, and it was born in conflict. So the development of weapons technologies are absolutely critical, and that includes conventional terrestrial strike capabilities. That is the only way to really solve those problems at scale. You move to the left from that, and it's advanced targeting systems in every domain, on the surface of the Earth, in space, and of course, space to terrestrial. And then you need the surveillance infrastructure, the training infrastructure, the test infrastructure that supports the service in learning how to operate in a contested environment. The Space Force is a warfighting service. Their job is to deliver combat effects in every domain in which contemporary forces and terrestrial forces in the Joint Force operates, and they're going to need those capabilities.
I think, I'll offer just the one answer on this. It's a classic Intel answer. It depends. What's the most critical technology going to be? It depends. Right. And I think we're naive if we expect to anticipate or expect to guess that perfectly. And the historical parallel I think about when I think about how the space domain's evolving today and will look like 5, 10, 15 years from now is the interwar period between World War I and World War II, where you had a lot of new technology in the air domain, on the land domain with armored vehicles, and at sea with aircraft carriers supplanting traditional battleships, right? You had all this evolving over the period of 20 years, and every military at the time was just sort of throwing ideas at the wall. And if you took sort of the concepts that militaries were thinking about in the early 1930s, radically different by the time you get to World War II and you're in the 40s, right? The Japanese built all these massive battleships expecting that to be a mainstay. And well, it's a good thing they built aircraft carriers for them, but for us, we invested heavily in that, ended up being the primary naval weapon platform by the end of the war. So if you think about applying that to space, and we have all these ideas and novel technologies, whether it's refueling systems or on-orbit, weapons of varying degrees we could talk about, ground-based, I really hesitate to try and, pin a point on one and say, this is it, right? This is the thing we need to put our money in. So it really is a hybrid approach. And I think maintaining flexibility is really how we get after this and kind of buy insurance. And I would say, fortunately for the U.S., we have a very robust commercial space sector that can innovate with a lot of these technologies quicker than the government can, and can experiment and find out what might work. So we have options available in the event something does, crisis does escalate.
This is one of the reasons that campaigning with commercial is so important.
Yeah.
Because the dynamic between operational concept development and technology development has been the driver of defense industrial innovation for decades, and really we saw that in the aviation domain in the 1930s. I mean, there are systems that have no other application outside of warfighting, like the P-51, the F-22, the F-35. Lockheed Martin doesn't sell F-35s to United Airlines. So this collaboration in operational concept development and tactics with the defense industrial base is I think really the only way we're going to get to scale with precise warfighting technologies and not sort of just guess.
Yeah, one point just to add, I think you made a point earlier about we're human resource constrained, right? I mean, if we're going to ask our guardians to be able to take on more warfighting functions, they shouldn't be spending time tracking SpaceX transporter launches and cataloging blue objects as part of the catalog that supports space safety. And so I think part of this is a cultural shift in looking at ways to through these again shoulder-to-shoulder partnerships with commercial identifying areas where they can stand down on certain missions that are inherently commercial or dual use so that they can focus their scarce resource on areas that are much more.
Tony, that's already been articulated by Space Force. In 2024, they released the commercial integration strategy that said, here are the things that will be inherently governmental, here are the things that are dual use, and then here are the things that will be purely pushed off towards commercial at this point. To me, I think Space Force has already identified it. I think we are kind of in that playground monkey bar world, which is unable to release one hand to go to the next rung along the way. So whether we're talking about World War I, World War II gaps, or we're talking about, hey, we still have to operate, we still have to provide capabilities to the joint force. At the same time, we're trying to re-architecture because of the threat. I mean, we're in this strange nebulous period right now, and I credit Space Force for finally putting out this vision out there. My only gripe with it is I think the title's wrong. I think the title should be 2035, not 2040.
2029.
Well said.
Okay, so last question, because we can't do this. So, Evan, you talked about, again, some of the capabilities you're going to need to do warfighting in space. Mike, I agree. There's the technologies all over the place. One thing we've learned from history is from the Peloponnesian Wars on is that conflict is going to be primarily kinetic. And as much as we talk about non-kinetics, our adversaries talk about the kinetic space. And there have been a lot of conflicts since the Peloponnesians to now, and every one of the targets that have been hit are somewhere lying on the earth or at the bottom of the ocean. So when you start talking about a kinetic conflict in space, whether it's us or our adversaries are going to be looking at the same thing, how do you start looking at debris? How do you start looking at debris mitigation? Because there are long-lasting effects. And is a conflict in space a one-and-done event?
Well, no, it's not, because a conflict is happening in space as we speak.
Kinetic. So
Kinetic.
if this escalates to a kinetic conflict in space,
No.
are you essentially, how do you mitigate the long-lasting effects that will occur?
Well, first, I think you got to do this from a normative setting perspective, right? You know, I know that there is somewhere like 40 or 50 nations have, you know, put out the policy following the United States about not doing kinetic debris forming ASAT tests because, as General Whiting talked about, it's just indiscriminate like a nuclear weapon in a way, right? And going along the way. So I think one is just getting the knowledge out there about like, this is really bad. Remember what happened after the Chinese ASAT test in 2007? International condemnation about littering this domain. We've had to move the International Space Station countless times because of the Chinese ASAT debris that was out there. So one, I think we've been talking about DOD, we've been talking about the intelligence community, but also part of our national security enterprise is our Department of State being able to make sure that our allies, partners, and potential adversaries understand the consequences of that. And to the other question, and then I'll turn it over to these guys, is look, I think, I don't know if it's a one and done. If you destroy one satellite, is that messaging? Or are we talking about destroying everything all at once, right? And to me, I think that's still a question about the war planners and the scenario designers about how does this all work?
I mean, I'll just offer, it really depends.
We got this one down.
Yeah.
That's always a good answer. You know,
It depends.
he is from the hill.
Yeah.
But I mean, here's how I break it down. If you take an adversary like Russia, or you could also put North Korea in this bin, where there is a clear asymmetric advantage, the U.S. has space superiority. Russia does operate, I mean, capable space actor, right? Rich legacy in the Soviet, they're capable, but they don't have nearly the capacity that the U.S. does, and they realize that. So for them, I think it's an easy trade-off.
Right.
If nobody can use space, whether it's because of debris or jamming, that's a net positive for them in a conflict, right? And I think that's why it's no surprise. We saw 2 years ago when it came out, they were developing a nuclear counterspace weapon, right? That fits right in with their doctrine of imposing costs on the U.S. In an area where there's a clear imbalance of value. On the flip side, and here's why I say it depends, China, I think the one silver lining of their rapid acceleration as a great space power now, they've launched over 1,000 satellites in the last decade, is they now have skin in the game. They have designed their military similar to ours, watching the exquisite precision strikes we're able to do anywhere on Earth, and they know space is critical to that. We've seen them dump money and invest into a space program, which debris is indiscriminate. So in their, you know, I am less convinced that they would take the approach of just, you know, wrecking the sandbox like Russia would, right? Because they have an inherent need to use space like we do. So I think it's going to be much more of a, you know, tailored strikes by China as opposed to Russia, where they're happy to just cause indiscriminate damage. So how that plays out in a conflict, again, I mean, trying to guess that is I think a, you know, fool's errand. But just I think there's two. It really does depend who you're talking about, whether it's a, you know, Russia, North Korea, or a China type actor here, and how that factors into deterrence and their willingness to generate debris.
No, that's good.
I think I've been sitting here thinking about how to parse this, watching Mike Palsky stare at me. As I think about the physics of it, I think I would add to the political and sort of like tactical and strategic, it depends is exactly right. The United States has no interest in generating debris because it's a Pyrrhic victory for the United States. We are dependent. China is dependent. As you said, I think you're right, it is totally threat dependent. However, their kinetic weapons in space don't necessarily mean hypervelocity kinetic weapons, where you're talking about Mach 30, well, I won't use it, 15 kilometer per second, 20 kilometer per second closing velocities. I think what you're gonna see happen over the next decade is, as the United States really understands the convergence of operational concepts with key orbital terrain, which is a key concept from the United States military doctrine around space, which specifies what orbits we care about and what orbits we intend to conduct operations in. The physics of each one of those environments and that key orbital terrain really matters. A debris generating event by China in GEO is very different from an orbital mechanics standpoint than a debris generating event in low Earth orbit or in VLEO, for example. So I think there's an opportunity that the Space Force may want to capitalize on, and maybe organizations like this can capitalize on, that gets into the nuance of debris. It's not kinetic weapons bad, non-kinetic weapons good. We have a physics problem, we have a threat problem, and we have a weapon type problem. And we need to be thoughtful beyond sort of the headlines around this. And it is probably time to have a more productive conversation.
Yeah, and it's both what are the types of kinetic weapons that the U.S. would employ, but also, what do we need to defend against? And it may be that we need to get far left of launch, or early in launch if we know that, a certain class of threat from an adversary, could have, catastrophic impacts.
It really does depend on the weapon. I mean, just because we talk about like direct-to-send ASAT's bad, well, not always, because as we demonstrated in 2008 and the Indians demonstrated later, you can do an intercept in LEO and not generate a lot of long-lasting debris. It might cause a spike.
It was not a
in the
direct-to-send
moment.
ASAT, it was a safety mission.
Well, yes, but let's just say that capability, right, to intercept. In our case, it was a satellite we needed to take offline in a safe manner, so it didn't pollute the Earth. In India's case, it was demonstrating a capability. But all that to be said, it really does matter what type of weapon you're talking about, because I think there's this notion that any kinetic event in space, there's going to be thousands of pieces of debris, and that's not the case. And I'd say for certain weapon systems, that might be the risk reward of if you're going to attack a very high value asset, and you're a U.S. high value asset, and you're an adversary, that risk reward might be there. You might be willing to generate that debris to take a very high value asset offline, whereas a proliferated constellation of many satellites, it just doesn't make sense to use one-shot kinetic weapons to go after Starlink, for example, right? I mean, thousands of satellites. That risk, it's just totally off balance. So I think there's a lot of nuance to this. Again, like it really depends both on threat actor, threat system.
But sorry, Scott, this goes to one thing that has only been talked about in a singular term, and it is an extreme level of it depends, and that's deterrence. And I think for a lot of the young professionals and military planners in this room, the permutations of deterrence is still not fully played out. Who are you trying to deter? If it's Russia, it's China. Those are two different actors, two different political systems in a way from a military perspective. What are you trying to deter? Is it acquisition, deployment, testing, operations? Is it against kinetic weapons utilization? Is it against electronic warfare capabilities? Is this against military conventional, nuclear command and control, national technical means, protecting allied and partner, deterring against attacks on allied and partner or commercial capabilities? The permutations are so infinite. And then the response actions having to go not just from space, but in all the different domains along the way. I think this is still an area that both, I think, governments need to think through, number one. Number two, I think organizations like CSIS and others, and military organizations. And to be quite honest, I think that there is an opportunity for Track 2 level dialogues with other nations that we consider hostile to U.S. interests along the way. And I think this all goes back to the final two words, which it depends.
It depends.
Yeah.
All right, we are out of time, and like every meeting I've been in with Chirag, he gets the last word. So I want to thank the panel. You guys are brilliant. This is a very good discussion, and I want to thank CSIS for hosting the event. So thank you all.